Hello and welcome, dear listeners, to another powerful episode of the English Globe. I'm Adam.
And I'm Julia, and we're so glad to have you here today with us. Whether you're listening at home, on your way to work, or maybe even somewhere across the globe, we want to thank you for choosing to spend your time with us.
Today, we're diving into a truly complex and deeply important topic, one that has shaped the Middle East and the global political landscape for over a decade. The title of today's episode is Assad's Syria. Can a new government rise from the ashes?
This topic matters not just because of what's happening inside Syria, but because of what Syria has come to represent in our world today. The struggle between authoritarian power and people's demand for freedom. The tragic human cost of civil war, the failure of international diplomacy, and the enduring resilience of a nation shattered by conflict.
Exactly. We're going to explore how Bashar al-Assad came to power, how Syria descended into a brutal civil war after the 2011 Arab Spring, and why, despite international condemnation, economic collapse, and massive humanitarian suffering, Assad's regime still survives.
We'll also look at whether there's any realistic path forward for Syria beyond Assad. Can a new government rise from the ashes? What would that even look like? And what are the real barriers preventing that change from happening?
And if you're wondering why this topic is so important right now, it's because even though the war in Syria rarely makes headlines anymore, the crisis is far from over. Over 12 million Syrians remain displaced, either internally or as refugees abroad. The economy is in ruins. There are deep wounds between communities, and the question of who should rule Syria in the future is still wide open.
That's right. Understanding Syria's story isn't just about history, it's about how power operates, how people resist, and what kind of world we want to live in. And here on the English Globe, we believe that learning about these topics in simple, clear English is one of the best ways to connect with global issues and improve your listening skills at the same time.
Before we begin, dear listeners, we'd love to ask you for a quick favor. If you enjoy these kinds of thoughtful global discussions, and you want to support English learning through real, meaningful topics, then please like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The English Globe. It really helps us reach more curious learners and listeners around the world.
And please do tell us in the comments, where are you listening from today? Whether you're in the Middle East, Europe, Africa, Asia, or anywhere else, we'd love to hear from you. And we especially want to know, what's your opinion about today's topic? Can Syria truly rise again after all it has been through? Is change even possible under Assad?
We'll be reading your thoughts and replying to as many comments as we can. So now, without further delay, let's begin this important journey into the heart of one of the world's most tragic and resilient nations, Syria, under Bashar al-Assad.
To understand whether a new government can rise in Syria, we must first understand the roots of the current one. Syria has been ruled by the Assad family for more than 5 decades. The story begins not with Bashar al-Assad, but with his father, Hafez al-Assad, who came to power in 1970 after a military coup. Hafez was a member of the Ba'ath Party, a political movement rooted in Arab nationalism and socialism. But under his control, it evolved into something far more authoritarian and centralized.
Under Hafez al-Assad, Syria became a one-party police state. The intelligence services, known as the Mukhabarat, penetrated nearly every aspect of life, from universities to mosques, from media to homes. Hafez established a political system that offered no real opposition, no press freedom, and no accountability. Dissent was brutally crushed. Perhaps the most infamous example was the Hama massacre of 1982, when Syrian forces shelled the city of Hama to suppress an uprising by the Muslim Brotherhood. Estimates of the death toll vary, but most sources agree that between 10,000 and 40,000 people were killed, and entire neighborhoods were flattened.
When Hafez died in June 2000, power passed not to an elected leader, but to his son, Bashar al-Assad. Bashar, who had been training to become an eye doctor in London, was not initially expected to lead. His older brother, Basil, was being groomed for succession. But after Basil died in a car accident in 1994, Bashar was rapidly brought into the military and political system to prepare him for rule. Within weeks of Hafez's death, the Syrian parliament amended the constitution to lower the minimum age requirement for a president, allowing the 34-year-old Bashar to take the reins.
At first, Bashar presented himself as a modernizer and reformer. In the early 2000s, there was a brief period known as the Damascus Spring, where political activists, intellectuals, and civil society members began holding forums, publishing statements, and cautiously calling for democratic reforms. There was hope, both inside and outside Syria, that Bashar would usher in a new era. But this hope didn't last long.
By late 2001, the Damascus Spring was over. Bashar's government cracked down on the gatherings, arrested leading reformers, and made it clear that political liberalization would not continue. Though the young president spoke the language of modernization, especially in terms of economic reform and digital connectivity, the structure of authoritarian rule remained untouched. The ruling Ba'ath Party continued to dominate political life, and emergency laws, which had been in place since 1963, gave the state broad powers to detain citizens without trial.
Throughout the 2000s, Bashar maintained tight control over political opposition while pursuing limited economic liberalization. A new elite emerged, often connected to the Assad family or the security services, that benefited from privatization and foreign investment. Corruption flourished. Meanwhile, deep inequalities grew between urban elites and the rural poor. By 2010, unemployment was high, food prices had risen, and rural communities were suffering from a prolonged drought that pushed many into poverty.
In the midst of these growing pressures, the Arab world was shaken in early 2011 by a wave of uprisings known as the Arab Spring. Protesters in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and elsewhere demanded democratic reform, jobs, and an end to police brutality. In March 2011, Syria joined this wave. The protests began in the southern city of Daraa, where schoolchildren were arrested and reportedly tortured for writing anti-regime graffiti. When locals protested, security forces opened fire. This ignited widespread anger across the country.
The regime responded not with dialogue, but with bullets, tanks, and torture. As protests grew across cities like Homs, Hama, Aleppo, and Damascus, the government escalated its crackdown. Security forces arrested thousands, many of whom were tortured or disappeared. Peaceful protesters were labeled as terrorists and foreign agents. Independent journalists were banned, and state media framed the uprising as a foreign conspiracy against the Syrian state.
By the end of 2011, the peaceful uprising had transformed into an armed conflict. Soldiers began defecting from the Syrian army, forming the Free Syrian Army, FSA, and other opposition groups. The regime's violent response, combined with sectarian tensions and foreign involvement, turned what began as a call for reform into a full-scale civil war. Over the next few years, Syria became one of the most complex and deadly conflicts in modern history.
Yet through all of this, Bashar al-Assad refused to step down. He framed the war as a fight against terrorism and foreign plots. He presented himself as the protector of secularism and stability, even as his forces bombed schools, hospitals, and marketplaces. Human rights groups and UN investigators documented numerous war crimes by regime forces, including chemical weapons attacks, indiscriminate airstrikes, and the systematic torture of detainees. Despite these findings, Assad remained in power.
So, how did he survive when leaders in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen were either removed or killed? The answer lies in part with foreign allies. Russia and Iran became Assad's lifeline. Iran provided billions in financial support, weapons, and fighters from Hezbollah and other militias. In 2015, Russia began a full-scale air campaign in Syria, targeting rebel groups and helping Assad retake key cities. Russian jets bombed opposition-held areas relentlessly, and their presence shifted the balance of power decisively.
Assad also benefited from divisions within the opposition. The rebel groups were fragmented, poorly coordinated, and often fought among themselves. Some were linked to jihadist movements, which made it easier for the regime to label them all as extremists. The rise of ISIS, in particular, changed the focus of international attention. The West turned its priority to defeating ISIS, often overlooking Assad's own atrocities.
At the same time, Assad held elections that were widely seen as symbolic and non-competitive. In 2021, he claimed victory in a presidential election with over 95% of the vote, despite most Western governments dismissing the process as illegitimate. The election was held under conditions of repression, with millions of Syrians in exile or in regime-controlled areas where dissent is not tolerated.
Today, Bashar al-Assad remains in control of about two-thirds of Syria's territory, including major cities like Damascus, Homs, Latakia, and Aleppo. However, large parts of the country remain outside his hands. The northeast is controlled by Kurdish-led forces backed by the U.S. Parts of the northwest, especially Idlib province, are held by rebel groups with Turkish support. Syria is effectively divided, with no clear path to national reconciliation.
This is the Syria that has emerged under Bashar al-Assad, a nation fragmented by war, drained by economic collapse, and ruled by a leader who has survived through a combination of repression, propaganda, foreign support, and the disintegration of alternatives. The idea of a political transition seems remote, but the question remains, can this system endure forever? Or will internal collapse, external pressure, or the will of the people eventually bring change?
In the next section of our podcast, we'll take you deeper into what happened after the uprising, the rise of armed groups, the role of foreign powers, and how Syria became the epicenter of one of the most devastating humanitarian crises of our time. Stay with us as we explore the dark spiral of war and the forces that have kept Assad in power.
The year 2011 began like many others in Syria, quietly tense, controlled by fear, and overshadowed by economic hardship. But the winds of change were sweeping across the Arab world. In Tunisia, a fruit seller's self-immolation sparked mass protests that toppled a dictator. In Egypt, millions filled Tahrir Square and forced Hosni Mubarak to resign. In Libya, Muammar Gaddafi's regime was being challenged. Across the Middle East and North Africa, authoritarian governments were under pressure like never before.
Syria, long thought to be immune to such uprisings due to its repressive state apparatus and powerful intelligence agencies, was next. The moment of ignition came in March 2011 in the small southern city of Daraa. A group of teenagers had scribbled anti-government graffiti on a school wall. The words were simple: "Your turn, doctor." It was a direct reference to Bashar al-Assad, the president who trained as an ophthalmologist.
The regime responded harshly. The boys were arrested and allegedly tortured by security forces. When their families and neighbors demanded their release, they were met with gunfire. The funerals of those killed turned into more protests. The more the government tried to suppress dissent, the more the protests grew, spreading to Homs, Hama, Aleppo, and even the capital, Damascus. Syrians had broken through a decades-long wall of fear.
What's important to remember here is that the initial demonstrations were peaceful. Protesters called for dignity, justice, political reform, and the end of emergency law, not the overthrow of the regime. They wanted change, not collapse. But the Assad government framed the protesters as terrorists and foreign agents. Within weeks, tanks were rolling into Syrian towns, and security forces were arresting thousands. Many were tortured in detention or simply disappeared.
The state's brutality was overwhelming. In neighborhoods like Baba Amr, in Homs, and Douma, near Damascus, government forces laid siege, cut off supplies, and shelled civilian areas. Social media and shaky cell phone videos showed bloodied children, screaming mothers, and flattened buildings. Yet the world largely watched without acting decisively. The UN condemned the violence, but Security Council action was blocked, largely due to Russia and China vetoing resolutions against Assad.
As peaceful protests were drowned in blood, parts of the opposition began to take up arms. In July 2011, defectors from the Syrian military announced the formation of the Free Syrian Army, FSA. Their goal was to defend civilians and bring down the Assad regime. They were joined by thousands of Syrians, former soldiers, students, farmers, and engineers, all of whom had lost faith in the possibility of peaceful reform.
From here, Syria spiraled into a full-blown civil war. Rebel groups sprang up across the country. Some were secular and nationalistic, others Islamist. Over time, foreign fighters joined the chaos. Weapons flowed in from neighboring countries, including Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. Assad, meanwhile, received weapons, intelligence, and militia support from Iran and Hezbollah. The battlefield became crowded, confused, and chaotic.
By 2012, Syria was no longer a single unified conflict. It had become a war of many wars, between the regime and rebels, between Sunni and Alawite groups, between moderate factions and extremists, and eventually between global powers. Cities like Aleppo, once Syria's largest and most vibrant economic center, became split between regime and rebel control. Daily airstrikes, barrel bombs, sniper fire, and starvation sieges turned neighborhoods into graveyards.
Then came perhaps the darkest twist of all: the rise of ISIS, the so-called Islamic State. In 2013 and 2014, this extremist group, born from the ashes of the Iraq War and hardened in Syria's chaos, seized vast territory in eastern Syria and western Iraq. In 2014, it declared a caliphate with Raqqa as its capital. ISIS imposed brutal rule, public executions, slavery, and religious extremism. Its rise alarmed the world.
Suddenly, the international focus shifted. The US and its allies, who had been hesitant to intervene directly against Assad, launched airstrikes against ISIS instead. Meanwhile, Assad portrayed himself as a lesser evil, telling the world, "It's either me or the terrorists." His forces even avoided clashing with ISIS early on, focusing instead on rebel groups that posed a more immediate threat to his power.
The humanitarian cost of this war was, and still is, staggering. According to the United Nations, more than 500,000 people have been killed, though some estimates go even higher. Over 6.8 million Syrians have fled the country as refugees, with millions more displaced within Syria. Hospitals and schools were bombed. Historic cities like Palmyra and Aleppo's old town were destroyed. Entire generations of children have grown up knowing only war.
Chemical weapons attacks shocked the global conscience. The worst came in August 2013 in Ghouta, a suburb of Damascus. Over 1,400 people died, many of them children, in a sarin gas attack that was widely attributed to Assad's forces. Although Assad denied responsibility, international investigators found clear and convincing evidence of chemical use. President Obama had previously warned that the use of chemical weapons would cross a red line, but the U.S. did not respond militarily. Instead, it reached a deal with Russia to dismantle Syria's chemical arsenal.
Many saw this as a missed opportunity, a moment when international resolve wavered, allowing Assad to continue his campaign with even more confidence. The war dragged on. New players entered the arena. Kurdish militias, known as the YPG and later the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, gained US support in the fight against ISIS. Turkey launched military operations in northern Syria, targeting both ISIS and Kurdish fighters it considered terrorists. Russia, beginning in 2015, launched an aggressive air campaign that saved Assad from near collapse.
By 2016 and 2017, the regime had regained much of its lost territory. The siege of Aleppo ended with a brutal government victory. Other rebel-held cities were bombed into submission or forced into surrender through so-called reconciliation deals that offered rebels a choice: leave for Idlib or face death. These deals, critics argue, were not reconciliation, but surrender under siege.
The world became fatigued. News of Syria faded from headlines, even as the suffering continued. Countries like Germany, Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey struggled to host millions of Syrian refugees. The United Nations' repeated efforts to broker peace, especially through the Geneva talks and the Astana process, failed to bring about a political transition. Assad's position, once seen as untenable, became increasingly secure.
In the end, the 2011 uprising that began with calls for dignity, justice, and reform had morphed into one of the most destructive conflicts of the 21st century. And Bashar al-Assad, the man whose rule sparked the crisis, was still in power. But at what cost?
The cities may bear his image on posters, but they are filled with ruins and silent ghosts. The people may whisper his name in fear, but many have fled, and millions more live in exile or in poverty. Syria, once known for its culture, civilization, and complexity, has been torn apart.
In the next section, we'll look at the rise of armed groups and international involvement, and how Syria became not just a civil war, but a proxy battlefield for global powers. Who controls Syria now? And how did foreign nations shape the outcome of this war? Stay with us as we unravel the next chapter in Syria's tragic history. As Syria descended deeper into war, the battlefield became more fragmented and chaotic. What began as a revolution led by civilians and defected soldiers soon evolved into a fight between dozens of factions, some seeking democracy, others driven by sectarianism, nationalism, or jihadist ideology. What made the conflict even more complex was how quickly it turned into a proxy war, with regional and global powers backing different sides, each with their own strategic interests.
By 2012 and 2013, the original opposition, the Free Syrian Army, or FSA, had already started to fragment. Many rebel commanders operated independently, often disagreeing on ideology, tactics, and long-term vision. Some fighters were nationalists, others moderate Islamists, and a few even aligned with more extreme Salafist beliefs. There was no unified chain of command. Arms and funding often flowed from outside Syria, from Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, mainly, but there was little coordination. This fragmentation would prove fatal in the years to come.
At the same time, Islamist groups began to gain ground. One of the most prominent was Jabhat al-Nusra, or the Nusra Front, which emerged as an al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. Though it fought against the Assad regime, it sought to create an Islamic emirate. Its fighters were often better trained and better armed than those in the FSA, and this gave them influence on the battlefield. Eventually, some rebel groups aligned themselves with Nusra out of necessity, not ideology, further complicating Western support.
Then came the rise of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. Initially part of al-Qaeda's network, ISIS split in 2014, claiming the Nusra Front had deviated from true jihad. ISIS quickly captured major territory in eastern Syria, including Raqqa, which it declared its capital, and parts of western Iraq, including Mosul. The group used brutal violence to terrify populations and attract attention. Public executions, slavery, suicide bombings, and cultural destruction became its trademarks.
ISIS changed the course of the war. Suddenly, the world's attention shifted from Assad's crimes to the threat posed by this terrifying new force. In 2014, the United States began leading a coalition of Western and regional powers in launching airstrikes against ISIS targets in both Syria and Iraq. The U.S. partnered with local ground forces, particularly Kurdish-led fighters in northern Syria, who became instrumental in pushing ISIS back. While Assad was not the target of the campaign, the shift in focus indirectly helped him.
As foreign governments scrambled to respond to ISIS, Russia saw an opportunity. In September 2015, Russia launched a full-scale military intervention in support of Bashar al-Assad. Russian aircraft bombed opposition-held areas, not just ISIS or Nusra, but also moderate rebel forces supported by the West. Russian warplanes hit hospitals, markets, schools, and civilian infrastructure under the justification of fighting terrorism. This intervention turned the tide of the war and ensured that Assad would not fall.
Russia's involvement was a game-changer. For years, the Assad regime had been on the defensive. Its army was stretched thin. Morale was low. Territory was being lost. But Russian air power, combined with Iranian-backed militias and Hezbollah fighters, helped the regime retake key cities like Aleppo, Homs, and eastern Ghouta. Assad's grip on power strengthened, even as the death toll rose and cities were reduced to rubble.
On the other side of the conflict, Turkey became increasingly active. Concerned about the growing power of Kurdish groups near its border, especially the YPG, which Ankara views as an extension of the PKK, a Kurdish separatist group in Turkey, the Turkish government launched multiple military operations into northern Syria. These included Operation Euphrates Shield in 2016, Operation Olive Branch in 2018, and Operation Peace Spring in 2019. Turkey carved out buffer zones along its southern border and displaced Kurdish fighters and civilians from those areas.
Meanwhile, Iran had been deeply involved since the early days of the conflict. As a longtime ally of the Assad regime, Iran saw Syria as a crucial part of its axis of resistance against Israel and Western influence. Tehran sent weapons, billions of dollars in support, and military advisors. It also mobilized Shiite militias from Iraq, Lebanon, Afghanistan, and Pakistan to fight alongside Assad's forces. The most famous of these was Hezbollah, the powerful Lebanese group that played a major combat role in battles like Qusair and Aleppo.
By 2017, the landscape of the Syrian war looked like a patchwork of control. Assad's forces, backed by Russia and Iran, held most of the major cities. ISIS controlled isolated pockets in the desert. Kurdish-led forces, backed by the US, held the northeast. Turkish-backed rebels controlled a strip of territory in the north. And Idlib, in the northwest, became the last major stronghold of opposition forces, many of whom had been pushed there through surrender deals from other parts of Syria.
Idlib's fate remains a ticking time bomb. The province is home to over 3 million people, many of them displaced from other parts of Syria. It's largely controlled by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, a former al-Qaeda affiliate. Assad and Russia have frequently bombed the region, but a full ground invasion has been avoided, largely due to Turkey's presence and ceasefire agreements. Still, civilians live under constant fear of airstrikes and humanitarian crisis, with limited access to aid and basic services.
International diplomacy has repeatedly tried, and failed, to bring about a political resolution. The Geneva process, led by the United Nations, has gone through multiple rounds of talks, but yielded little progress. Assad has consistently rejected any negotiation that threatens his hold on power. The Astana process, led by Russia, Turkey, and Iran, has focused more on military de-escalation zones than political change. Even the formation of a constitutional committee in 2019 made little impact, as Assad's representatives blocked meaningful reform.
The war has left Syria divided not just physically, but socially and politically. There's no clear path to reunification. Trust between communities, Sunni, Alawite, Christian, Druze, Kurdish, has been shattered. The regime's brutal tactics, the rise of extremist groups, and the heavy hand of foreign actors have left deep scars. Each international player has its own agenda, and none appear willing to push for Assad's removal, especially now that he controls most of the territory and has the backing of two UN Security Council powers, Russia and China.
What makes the Syrian conflict so tragic is not only the scale of death and destruction, but also the lack of justice and accountability. War crimes have been well documented by human rights groups: chemical attacks, mass executions, forced starvation, and indiscriminate bombing. Yet few have been held accountable. Assad remains president. Some countries are even moving toward normalizing relations with his regime, citing the need for stability and the fight against terrorism.
It's a sobering reality. The Assad regime, once thought to be near collapse, has been reinforced by global inaction, division among rebel groups, and the prioritization of strategic interests over human rights. At the same time, Syrians continue to suffer. The economy has collapsed. Infrastructure is broken. Corruption is rampant. In areas under regime control, basic necessities like food, electricity, and healthcare are in short supply. Sanctions and international isolation have deepened the crisis.
Yet, in all this darkness, Syrians continue to resist in quieter ways, through art, education, online activism, and rebuilding communities where they can. Some speak out from exile. Others work underground within Syria. Their voices are often silenced or ignored, but they persist. For many, the dream of a free and democratic Syria has not died. It has simply gone underground, waiting for the conditions to rise again.
In our next section, we'll explore the current political and humanitarian situation inside Syria. What is life like today for the average Syrian under Assad? How have sanctions, inflation, and displacement shaped daily survival? And what are the prospects, if any, for reconstruction, reconciliation, or recovery? Stay with us as we continue peeling back the layers of this deeply wounded nation. Now, Julia, let's really take a look at how Bashar al-Assad managed to survive what many thought was the end of his regime. In 2011 and 2012, most observers, Western governments, analysts, even Arab neighbors, believed that Assad's downfall was just a matter of time. The protests had turned into a nationwide armed rebellion. Whole towns and cities were rising up. His army was defecting, opposition forces were gaining momentum, and Syria was becoming increasingly ungovernable for the central government. But somehow, more than a decade later, Assad is still in power. How did he do it?
It's a complex and brutal story, Adam. Assad's survival can be largely attributed to two main foreign backers, Russia and Iran. First, Iran stepped in early in the conflict, sending financial aid, fuel, and crucially, military advisors and proxy militias like Hezbollah. They framed their intervention as part of a broader axis of resistance against US and Israeli influence in the region. Then came Russia, in a much more dramatic and decisive way. In 2015, just as Assad's forces were losing control of key territories, including Aleppo and areas near Damascus, Russia launched a massive military campaign in Syria.
Exactly, Julia. That Russian intervention was a turning point. Their air force bombed rebel-held areas, often indiscriminately, destroying entire neighborhoods, hospitals, and civilian infrastructure. The goal wasn't just military, it was psychological. It was about showing the world that Russia stands by its allies, unlike what happened in Libya, where Gaddafi was overthrown. Vladimir Putin sent a clear message: Assad stays. And with that level of support, combined with boots on the ground from Iran-backed groups, Assad managed to retake large areas like eastern Ghouta, Homs, Aleppo, and eventually parts of southern Syria.
But let's be honest, Adam. This came at a terrible cost for Syria. The Assad regime used chemical weapons multiple times, most notably in eastern Ghouta in 2013, and Khan Shaykhun in 2017, leading to global outrage. While the US did launch some missile strikes, they were limited and didn't change the balance of power. Meanwhile, Russian and Syrian jets continued carpet-bombing cities. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and the UN all documented these war crimes. Yet, Assad remained in power because geopolitics trumped human rights. Russia blocked almost every resolution at the UN Security Council that called for sanctions or regime change.
And here's what many people don't understand. Assad may have won back territory, but he lost legitimacy in the eyes of millions of Syrians. Over 13 million people, more than half of Syria's pre-war population, were displaced, either inside the country or as refugees abroad. Entire neighborhoods in Aleppo, Homs, and Raqqa were reduced to rubble. The economy is shattered. The Syrian pound lost almost all its value. Basic goods are unaffordable. Electricity is unreliable. Water systems are destroyed. Hospitals are barely functioning. It's a humanitarian disaster, and the government simply doesn't have the resources to rebuild.
And this brings us to a crucial point, Adam. Assad may have won the war militarily, but he's governing a ghost country. A country in ruins. Cities where children grow up without schools, homes, or a sense of future. The war destroyed not only buildings but the very social fabric of Syria. Trust between communities has eroded, sectarian divisions deepened, families were torn apart. Many Syrians in exile say they will never return while Assad remains in power. They fear arrest, torture, or forced conscription. Remember the infamous prisons like Saidnaya? Amnesty International called them human slaughterhouses.
And yet, despite all this, Assad has started re-entering regional diplomacy. In 2023, the Arab League readmitted Syria after more than a decade of suspension. Several Arab countries, including the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, began re-engaging diplomatically. It's partly due to fatigue. They believe the war is over, and it's time to bring Syria back into the Arab fold. Others think isolating Assad hasn't worked. Still, that doesn't mean people have forgotten the atrocities. Western countries like the US, UK, and EU continue to impose strict sanctions under laws like the Caesar Act, and they still officially reject normalization without accountability or political reform.
Right. But those sanctions, while targeting the regime, also affect the broader population. Inflation is insane. Medical supplies are short. Reconstruction is stalled because companies are afraid to work in Syria. Even NGOs have trouble getting aid in. So, it becomes this vicious cycle. Assad blames the sanctions for economic misery, but the root cause remains the destruction brought by the war and the regime's unwillingness to change. There's still no meaningful reform, no accountability for war crimes, no steps toward a democratic process.
And Julia, let's not forget the loss of sovereignty. Huge parts of Syria are effectively under foreign control. Turkey controls parts of the north, especially areas with Kurdish populations. The US still maintains troops in the northeast, mostly to fight remnants of ISIS and support Kurdish forces. Iran-backed militias operate freely in southern and eastern Syria. And Russia? Russia controls strategic air bases and ports. It's like Syria is no longer a unified state, but a patchwork of foreign interests. Assad may be president on paper, but he's dependent on outsiders to stay in power.
So, to sum up this part of our conversation, Assad's survival was not a victory for Syria. It was a survival for the regime, but at the cost of national unity, civilian lives, and the future of an entire generation. Russia and Iran helped him win militarily, but Syria has lost almost everything else. Economically, diplomatically, socially, and morally. And now the question becomes, what comes next? Can a new government really rise from the ashes of this destruction? Can the international community do anything meaningful to support the Syrian people? Or is Syria stuck in a post-war limbo, neither in peace nor in transition?
As the Syrian civil war dragged on, many experts and even government officials around the world predicted that Bashar al-Assad would fall. In fact, by 2012 and 2013, several Western governments, including the United States, openly declared that Assad had lost legitimacy. At the time, rebel forces controlled large parts of the country, including suburbs of Damascus. But against all odds, Assad managed not only to survive, but to retake much of Syria. The big question is, how? What were the turning points?
Great question, Adam. To understand Assad's survival, we have to look beyond Syria's borders. The single most decisive factor was the intervention of Russia in 2015. Vladimir Putin authorized a full-scale military campaign to prop up the Assad regime, claiming it was to fight terrorism, especially ISIS. However, Russia's real objective was to ensure Assad remained in power. Russian airstrikes began targeting not just ISIS, but also Western-backed rebel groups and civilian areas in opposition strongholds like Aleppo and Idlib.
That's right, Julia. Before Russia stepped in, Assad was losing ground fast. But Russia's military support changed the game entirely. Their air force provided Assad with the firepower he lacked. Russian jets bombed rebel positions relentlessly, while Syrian ground forces advanced behind them. In just a year, Assad regained major territory, and Russia established permanent military bases in Syria, like the Hmeimim Air Base in Latakia and the naval base in Tartus. This wasn't just about Syria. It was about Russia projecting power in the Middle East.
And we can't forget Iran's role either. Since the early stages of the conflict, Iran provided crucial support, money, weapons, and manpower. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard and Hezbollah fighters from Lebanon were deeply involved on the ground. Iran framed its intervention as a fight against Sunni extremism and a way to protect Shiite communities. But the strategic goal was to preserve the so-called Shia Crescent, an arc of influence from Iran through Iraq and Syria to Lebanon. Assad, being Alawite, a sect related to Shiism, was Iran's key ally in this chain.
Together, Russia and Iran formed a powerful alliance to keep Assad in power. And let's be honest, the West was hesitant and divided. The U.S. had supported certain rebel groups, but never to the extent that could shift the balance. Plus, the rise of ISIS in 2014 redirected global focus. Suddenly, the priority wasn't removing Assad, it was defeating ISIS. This shift gave Assad the breathing room he needed. In fact, Assad often tried to frame the war as a choice between him or jihadist chaos.
That narrative worked. Many Syrians, especially from religious minorities, began to see Assad as the lesser evil. Meanwhile, Russia used its UN Security Council veto to block resolutions that could pressure Assad. Diplomatically and militarily, Assad was protected. Over time, his forces recaptured major cities like Homs, Hama, Aleppo, and even areas around Damascus. By 2019, Assad controlled roughly two-thirds of Syria again, though large areas in the northeast and northwest remained outside regime hands.
But let's not overlook the human cost of this survival. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed, mostly by regime and Russian bombings. Cities were flattened. Hospitals and schools were destroyed. Over 13 million Syrians, more than half the population, were displaced internally or became refugees abroad. Assad's strategy of survival was brutal: siege, starve, and bomb opposition areas into submission. Entire towns like eastern Ghouta and Dara faced this scorched earth policy.
The use of chemical weapons also became a notorious part of Assad's campaign. In 2013, the world was shocked by a sarin gas attack in Ghouta, killing over 1,400 people. The US almost launched military strikes, but in the end, a deal was brokered where Assad agreed to surrender his chemical weapons. Yet, reports of chlorine attacks and other chemical agents have continued since. Organizations like the OPCW have confirmed several of these attacks were carried out by regime forces, despite denials.
And still, Assad stayed in power. Why? Because for Moscow and Tehran, Assad was a loyal partner. He offered access, influence, and leverage. Russia even tested new weapons in Syria, using the war as a military laboratory. Iran used the war to expand its militia networks and smuggle arms to Hezbollah. In return, Assad allowed them freedom to operate. But this alliance came with a cost. Syria lost much of its sovereignty. Foreign powers began deciding the future of the country more than Syrians themselves.
Economically, too, Syria was devastated. Infrastructure collapsed, inflation soared, and entire industries were lost. Assad's regime now depends heavily on foreign aid from Iran, Russian protection, and illicit networks. Sanctions from the West have cut off formal access to many markets. The Caesar Act, for example, imposed harsh US sanctions on Syrian and foreign companies doing business with the regime. This further isolated Assad economically, even as he gained military ground.
There's also the political side of Assad's survival. He held staged elections in 2021 and claimed victory with 95% of the vote, results widely mocked by the international community. These elections had no legitimacy in the eyes of the UN, but they signaled something important. Assad wasn't just surviving, he was declaring victory. He was saying, "I'm still here, and I'm not going anywhere." That message was not just for Syrians, but for the world. And slowly, some Arab states began to normalize relations with Damascus.
Yes, that's a significant shift. In 2023, Syria was readmitted into the Arab League, despite protests from some member states. Countries like the UAE and Egypt reopened embassies and pushed for regional dialogue. Their argument was that isolating Syria had failed, and now it was better to bring Assad in from the cold. However, others argue this sends the wrong message, that mass repression and war crimes can be ignored if enough time passes.
So in summary, Assad's survival was not a miracle. It was the result of foreign military intervention, strategic alliances, brutal repression, and shifting international priorities. But surviving isn't the same as thriving. Syria today remains a broken nation, its future uncertain. And that brings us to the next big question we'll explore. Is there any real political opposition left that could challenge Assad? Or has the space for alternatives completely disappeared?
That's what we'll get into next, dear listeners. If you're following this story, you know how complex and emotional it can be. We encourage you to reflect. Did Assad truly win? Or did everyone lose in this war? And what lessons can the world learn from how he stayed in power?
Now that we've unpacked the long years of civil war and the regime's survival, let's dive into one of the most crucial questions on everyone's mind. Is real political transition even possible in Syria right now? And if yes, what would that look like?
Right, Adam. There are three main lenses we can look through here: domestic dynamics, regional powers, and international diplomacy. Let's start with the domestic landscape. President Bashar al-Assad remains in control of most major cities: Damascus, Homs, Aleppo. But that doesn't mean he has unified legitimacy. A large portion of the population, especially in the northwest and northeast, either rejects the regime outright or simply tolerates it out of fear and exhaustion.
And there's something deeper here. Over the past decade, the Assad government has relied heavily on military intelligence, security services, and militia networks to keep the population in check. So, even if there was a push for reform or a new political system, the architecture of repression is deeply entrenched. Any shift would require a dismantling or deep reform of this system, a Herculean task.
And we haven't even gotten to the northeast. The Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces still control large parts of Hasakah and parts of Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor. These areas operate under a different model: semi-autonomous administration, backed largely by the United States. While Damascus wants to reclaim all territory, these Kurdish zones have their own vision for federalism and decentralization.
Exactly. And here's where the question of a new government gets complicated. Do we imagine a totally new leadership replacing Assad? A power-sharing agreement with Kurdish factions? Or a constitutional reform that brings in former opposition figures? Each of these options carries risk and resistance.
Let's also consider the Astana process. Remember, Adam, this is the peace process led by Russia, Turkey, and Iran. They've created de-escalation zones and facilitated talks between the regime and parts of the opposition. But the truth is, these talks haven't delivered any substantial transition. Assad still holds the upper hand. Russia remains his most powerful ally, and Iran benefits from his survival.
You're right. In fact, one of the major challenges to any future government is the extent of foreign influence. Iran has built deep-rooted militias and economic ties in Syria, especially around Damascus and the border with Iraq. Russia controls key air bases and ports, like Hmeimim and Tartus. Any real political change would have to navigate these entanglements.
Not to mention Turkey, which controls a stretch of land along the northern border and continues to fight the Kurdish YPG, which it sees as a terrorist group. Turkey also supports opposition groups in Idlib, so Syria in many ways is fractured into zones of foreign influence. That makes forming a new unified government very complex.
Now let's zoom out to the global stage. The United Nations has tried to broker peace through the Geneva process. There's a constitutional committee, co-chaired by regime and opposition representatives, but it's made little progress. Some rounds ended in total silence. Assad doesn't see these talks as necessary. He feels emboldened by his survival and Russia's backing.
And meanwhile, Western nations, particularly the US and EU, maintain sanctions on Syria. They argue that normalization without reform is a betrayal of Syrian people who protested peacefully in 2011. Some Gulf countries like the UAE and even Saudi Arabia have started engaging with Assad diplomatically. This normalization trend could either freeze reforms or open new channels for negotiation, depending on how it's handled.
But here's a key point for our listeners. Can a country rebuild politically when more than half its population has been displaced? Millions of Syrians live in exile, in refugee camps in Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, and Europe. Others are internally displaced. For a new government to have legitimacy, it must represent these people too, not just those under regime control.
Absolutely, Adam. And here's where transitional justice matters. If Syria ever moves toward a new government, there will have to be some process of reckoning, trials, truth commissions, or at least some accountability for war crimes. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have documented mass atrocities, including torture, starvation sieges, chemical weapons, and disappearances.
But Assad has resisted any such process. And as long as he's in power, transitional justice is virtually impossible. Which brings us to this hard truth. Many Syrians no longer talk about a new government as a realistic short-term goal. Instead, they talk about survival, recovery, and finding justice outside the system, through international courts or local memorialization.
So what does hope look like? Maybe it's in civil society. Despite the war, grassroots organizations continue to document abuses, teach children in refugee camps, run clinics, and push for dialogue. They may not hold political power, but they're shaping the moral foundation for a future Syria. If not now, then for the next generation.
And remember, revolutions aren't always linear. In Eastern Europe, South Africa, even in Latin America, political change sometimes took decades. The demand for freedom and dignity, once voiced, rarely dies completely. It lingers, shapes the narrative, and resurfaces when the time is right.
And let's not forget the resilience of Syrians. After everything they've endured, bombings, sieges, displacement, they still write, speak, organize, and resist in small and big ways. So even if Assad remains in power for now, the story of Syria's future isn't finished.
That's a powerful note to end this segment on. When we come back, we'll explore some potential scenarios for Syria's next 10 years. Will the status quo hold? Could there be fragmentation, federalism, or a power transition? And what role will international actors play going forward? Now, Julia, as we dive deeper into this complex question, whether a new government can emerge in Syria after Assad, we have to look at the groups that might actually take the reins if such a transition were to happen. Who would step in? Who even has the structure, legitimacy, and internal support to fill that vacuum?
That's the million-dollar question, Adam. For years, the international community, especially Western nations, have supported parts of the Syrian opposition, hoping to build an alternative to Assad. But the opposition is deeply fragmented. You have the Turkish-backed Syrian Interim Government, SEG, the Kurdish-led Autonomous Administration in the northeast, and smaller groups affiliated with former Free Syrian Army factions. None of them alone has the full legitimacy or territorial control to govern all of Syria. And even collectively, they lack a unifying ideology or structure.
And that's a real challenge. Let's take the Syrian interim government, for example. It was formed in exile and is mostly based in northern Syria, heavily reliant on Turkey. While they've tried to set up schools, local councils, and basic governance, their capacity is still limited. And their very association with Turkey makes them controversial within Syria. Many Syrians fear that such groups might be tools of foreign influence rather than representatives of national interests.
Exactly. And then there's the autonomous administration in northeastern Syria, led by the Kurds, particularly the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF. They've developed a relatively stable system of governance in areas they control, including democratic councils, gender equality laws, and education in local languages. But they also face intense pressure from Turkey and skepticism from both the Assad regime and parts of the Arab population in Syria, who view their model as separatist or overly dominated by Kurdish leadership.
And then we must consider the role of extremist groups, unfortunately. In some areas, especially in Idlib province, groups like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, formerly affiliated with al-Qaeda, hold sway. While they've also tried to present a more governing image recently, their past and ideology make them unsuitable in the eyes of the broader international community. No one wants to see Syria fall into the hands of extremists.
And even if we imagine a post-Assad Syria tomorrow, it's not just about filling a power vacuum. It's about long-term governance, reconciliation, rebuilding a shattered state, and addressing war crimes. The road ahead is not only political but legal, humanitarian, and social.
So here's an important point for our listeners. The question isn't just, can Assad be replaced? It's, replaced by who and with what kind of government? And how do you unite a population that's been so deeply divided, traumatized, and scattered? Millions of Syrians are still refugees, many of them unlikely to return unless there's a fundamental shift in governance.
You raise a powerful point, Adam. According to the UNHCR, over 13 million Syrians have been displaced, with about 6.7 million refugees living abroad and another 6.7 million internally displaced. These people need security, trust in the government, and infrastructure to come back. Without them, any new government might inherit an empty shell of a country.
And that leads us to international diplomacy. The United Nations, for years, has supported the idea of a transitional government through the Geneva peace process. The idea was to bring the Assad regime and opposition to the table and chart a political roadmap, including a new constitution and elections. But that process has stalled. Assad feels emboldened after regaining military control of much of Syria, and he's had the support of Russia and Iran to solidify that power.
True. Russia has played a pivotal role in propping up Assad militarily and diplomatically, and Iran's influence through Hezbollah and other militias gives Assad a robust network of support. On the other hand, Western countries like the US and EU continue to impose sanctions and refuse to recognize his legitimacy. But sanctions haven't led to regime change. They've mostly hurt ordinary Syrians.
So the big question, again, is whether there's a peaceful path forward. Some experts believe that over time, economic pressure and political fatigue might force Assad into some form of compromise. Others believe that only a complete breakdown, another wave of protests, elite defection, or even health issues with Assad might create the conditions for change.
And if that change does come, then international actors, especially the UN, EU, Arab League, and key players like Turkey, Russia, and the US, will have to coordinate quickly to prevent another power vacuum. Syria cannot afford a scenario like post-Gaddafi Libya or post-Saddam Iraq, where removing a dictator led to chaos.
Absolutely. Rebuilding Syria would require massive international aid, institutional reform, accountability mechanisms, and above all, Syrian leadership and unity. It's not a project for outsiders alone, and it's not something that can be imposed. Syrians from every sect, ethnicity, and background need to be included.
And that's perhaps the most difficult part. After years of sectarian rhetoric, violence, and displacement, building trust won't be easy. But it is possible. Other countries have done it. Look at Rwanda's post-genocide reconciliation, or South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It takes time, honesty, and leadership.
So to summarize this part of our discussion, dear listeners, while Assad's fall is theoretically possible, a new government wouldn't rise automatically from the ashes. It would take careful planning, strong institutions, real representation, and international support. The Syrian people deserve a peaceful, democratic future, but that future must be built step by step.
And we want to hear from you. What do you think? Can Syria find a peaceful path forward without Assad? If so, who should lead? What kind of government would truly represent all Syrians? Drop your thoughts in the comments, wherever you're listening.
As we come to the end of today's deep and emotional journey through the political, historical, and humanitarian complexities of Syria under Bashar al-Assad, it's important to pause and reflect on everything we've covered. From the roots of the Syrian uprising in 2011 to the brutal civil war, from international involvement to Russia and Iran's support for the regime, from the devastated cities to the refugee crisis, and finally, the pressing question, can a new government rise from the ashes?
And what a heavy question it is, Adam. The reality is, Syria's future remains fragile. Yes, Assad holds power over most of the country. Yes, his regime has proven resilient, but that doesn't mean the story is over. Authoritarian power doesn't always equal stability. Millions of Syrians still live outside the country. Entire generations have grown up without peace, without education, and without hope of a return home. For a new government to rise, we need more than just a political shift. We need healing, justice, and accountability.
Exactly. And we need the world to care, not just through words, but through action. That includes supporting Syrian civil society groups, pushing for justice in international courts, and empowering Syrians to build institutions free from fear and repression. Rebuilding Syria is not just about infrastructure, it's about trust, governance, and dignity.
There is no clear roadmap ahead, but history tells us that even the darkest chapters can give rise to transformation. Look at post-war Germany, Rwanda, or even parts of Eastern Europe after the Cold War. These stories show us that societies can rebuild, but they didn't do it alone. It required international solidarity and, most importantly, the will of the people.
The Syrian people have shown extraordinary resilience, from the white helmets rescuing victims from bombed-out buildings, to teachers continuing lessons in underground classrooms, to journalists risking their lives to show the truth. This is where real hope lies, not in foreign powers, not in broken promises, but in the people themselves.
To all our dear listeners, this isn't just a story of war and destruction. It's a call to remember the human cost, the fight for freedom, and the enduring spirit of a people who deserve peace, justice, and a future. Whether you're listening from Europe, the Middle East, North America, or anywhere else in the world, we invite you to stay engaged, stay informed, and use your voice.
Before we wrap up, we want to sincerely thank each of you for spending your valuable time with us on the English Globe. If today's podcast made you think, touched your heart, or gave you new understanding, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with your friends. Your support helps us bring more real, raw, and relevant global stories to life in simple English.
And one last thing, we want to hear your voice too. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from and what you think. Do you believe Syria can have a new future without Assad? What should the international community do? What role should justice play? We read every comment, and we love hearing from you.
This is not the end of Syria's story, and it's not the end of our conversation either. Stay tuned for future episodes where we continue to explore the world's most complex stories in simple, powerful English. Until then, stay informed, stay kind, and never stop seeking truth.
Goodbye, everyone. Take care, and we'll see you in the next episode of the English Globe.